outside the box lines of evidence or something. We'd like to communicate about that ahead of time so we can kind of get all on the same page instead of waiting until the last minute when the property owner's waiting for their closure to happen. Okay. So for groundwater sampling and PARM, 780 usually requires 4/4 of PARM, and the last two meeting, the NFA. Representative locations is sometimes open to judgment, but excavations also require 4/4 of PARM, and we do try to put wells in representative location. If we're replacing wells, we try to put them maybe not well for well, but at least representing the same areas of contamination as we had before. Interim source removals only are the ones that may require only 2 sampling events. An interim source removal has a specific definition. It's mostly meant for dealing with a discharge. It's like a step down from emergency response, and you know, just to abate a nuisance or remove something before we have time to do the full assessment and wrap. Not just because we decide to call it an interim source removal. And then if groundwater contamination did not exist prior to the remediation to like an excavation, in some cases you only need 1 groundwater sample after that. Okay? Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about no further action proposals and what we see in Tallahassee. So if we recommend the NFA recommendation, you know, comes from the contractors, from their PGs or PEs. It should be sealed and help explain how the NFA criteria are met, how it meets different sections, whichever sections of 62.780 that it does meet, how groundwater and soil leachability and direct exposure are met with tables and maps, depth of water, plume maps for a conditional closure. Unless it's really straightforward, if we get a package here, it might be the first time we've ever seen the site, so it helps if you can lead us on a little bit with how the site meets the criteria that you're recommending. Okay? As I mentioned, conditional closure, there should be soil and groundwater plume maps because there's either soil and or groundwater contamination is left on site. That's why it's a conditional closure, so we want to know where that is. The groundwater plume's got to be stable or shrinking. You have to have at least a year of monitoring to show that that it is stable or shrinking. And soil contamination, you may require an engineering control over the area, 2 feet of clean soil or an impervious surface to prevent rainwater infiltration, and that's why we need a map of the soil to make sure the EC covers the same area as the soil contamination. And then the contaminant plumes, you know, we need, as I was saying, we need to know that the restricted area covers where the contamination is, and groundwater plumes typically require an exclusion buffer so that you can't put a well right next to where the groundwater plume is that, you know, might pull the plume, mobilize it, you know, especially a shallower well, irrigation well or something, or any kind of well that would be too close to that contamination could cause a migration of the plume. Okay. And our program has some guidance on closure, the depth of water. It's generally the depth of water at the final sampling event will define the unsaturated zone, and that unsaturated is where the SCTLs apply. Of course, we don't want to do it after a rain event, a hurricane or something, and then all of a sudden the depth of water is 3 feet higher than it was before. It's normal seasonal variation. And smear zone and capillary fringe are not in 62780, so we just ask to be careful when we're using those in a closure discussion. There is some judgment in that area, but generally we are taking the depth of water of the last sampling event at closure time. Closure decisions only, really. Okay. I'm going to talk a little bit about low scored site initiative, LSSI, another closure option that is not sometimes forgotten about, I think. Next. So it is another closure option, and it is in the statute. It's not 62780. A little simpler than a conditional closure. A site has to be scored 29 or less, and any site that meets that score can voluntarily participate in the LSSI. It doesn't have to be a funded site. An owner cleanup voluntary site can also apply for the LSSI. And if the discharge meets all the conditions which are spelled out in the statute, the property owner can request the LSSI NFA, regardless of whether they started out seeking LSSI closure. They may have been going for RMO1 and found out they don't meet it, but they meet LSSI, and then they can say, well, I want to do LSSI closure then. Okay? Okay, for funded discharges that choose to do the LSSI, the department can fund up to $35,000 for assessment, and then if it will lead to closure, an additional $35,000 for limited remediation. But $35,000, it's definitely going to be limited anyway. And then the state-funded assessment and remediation is supposed to be completed, or must be completed within 15 months after the work order is issued. And assessment and remediation can be followed up by up to 12 months of groundwater monitoring when it's needed to obtain closure. Okay? I'm sorry, I had a little trouble with my voice. So the no further action criteria, which are spelled out in the statute, it says that soil, you can't have soil saturated with petroleum or petroleum products, or soil that is 500 ppm for the GAG group, or 50 for the kerosene analytical group. That those cannot exist on site as a result of the release of petroleum products. Next. And you need a minimum of 12 months of groundwater monitoring to show that the plume is shrinking or stable, similar to conditional closure. Adjacent surface waters are not adversely affected. Next. And contamination has to be either on the source property or if it has migrated under a transportation facility that has an agreement, sort of like the DOT MOU, something similar to that, where there's an agreement between them and the department on the institutional control. Next. Okay, and also groundwater contamination is not a threat to any potable water supply well which you would expect, just like any other closure. Okay, next. Okay, and then the soils are sometimes a little trickier part, but soils in the top 2 feet meet the SCTLs, or you have to do institutional engineering controls, which basically makes it a DRC again, because you have to maintain the controls, and they have to be written in that the cap or whatever control you have has to be maintained. So that really makes it an RMO2 closure. But soils in the top 2 feet, for LSSI closure, soils in the top 2 feet meet the SCTLs. Next. And the LSSI closure doesn't require the deed restriction, the DRC, but it's noted in the closure order and listed in the institutional control registry. So it is a little simpler for the property owner. It doesn't go on the deed. It is noted there is still limited contamination left on the site, but it's a little easier, simpler way to close a site with minor contamination. Okay? All right, just a few little notes about wraps and where we are these days. Okay, next. So we have a lot of our funded sites, so particularly for funded sites, if we're in natural attenuation monitoring, we still have sites that have been in natural attenuation for several years. If these can be moved to remediation, where contamination is accessible, we would like to see these move into remediation, see a wrap done on these. And then, if there is a reason we can't, maybe there's a building in the way. That happens frequently, a building or a road. Then, some of those may just have to stay in long-term NAM. But then if let the department know if there's a problem with a school, surface water bodies, receptors, sensitive receptors, we'd like to know about those ahead of time. Okay? So ideally we want to see the wraps scope for all contaminated media, the soil and groundwater, all the petroleum contaminants, including lead and metals, which, are sometimes have to have a different treatment method than just your BTEX. The designs should be slanted towards the kind of closure we're going for. If we're going for conditional closure, then trying to get the contamination back on the property, or you don't have to get down to 1 benzene to do a conditional closure. But if we can achieve RMO1, then we want to be scoped with a good effort towards reaching RMO1. And then it's not the department's goal to keep remediation costs under $325,000. They become a bid, a quote when they go above that threshold. But the department would like to see the contamination addressed, and not totally regardless of the cost, but we would like to not hold it artificially below $325,000. I guess is the point for that. Okay. So if we're doing some kind of underground injection control, then the parameters that need to be monitored should be in the wrap, but there should be a plan to monitor those, put in the wrap ahead of time, so we know where we're going and what we have to monitor for. We want to definitely do samples, background samples, before the injection's done, both like source and outside source areas. to see what our baseline is for sodium or whatever is on the site, so we know what we're shooting for when the UIC parameters are being monitored after the injection. Yeah, and exceedance, if we can't get these parameters back down to baseline, then sometimes it will result in a conditional closure. Okay? And another sort of special case is site development. We do have a lot of properties that are being redeveloped. And when we can, we want to either get that last sample before they raise the site and destroy all the wells, or if we can, it may be our one opportunity to get in there and do an excavation. The building is out of the way, or pavement's gone, or whatever the site redevelopment plan is. If we can get in with the owner and the construction people, and as somebody mentioned yesterday, stay out of their way as much as we can, but if it can be coordinated, we would like to be able to get in there. And it's usually an excavation because you have to get in and out, maybe able to do that, time it in between their raising and rebuilding. And then at some point, sometimes you can do maybe well installations or trenching before the resurfacing is done, and sometimes not, but anything we can take advantage of to fit in with the redevelopment schedule and still be able to get some remediation done, and we would like to do that. And these are, in a way, this is an exception to trying to do the complete remediation, because you're just trying to do what you can while the site's accessible, because it may not be accessible again for decades after that. So we just want to get in and do what we can with that. Okay. All right, that's all I've got for you today. And I guess we're doing questions at the end.
Yeah, that's the plan, James, if that's good for you.
Okay, yeah, there's my contact information. A lot of you know it already, so contact me if you need me.
Thank you, James.
Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning.
Attention up here to us. Leah Smith is joining us today. She's doing district support and Division of Waste Management as well as part of Environmental Protection. She's going to talk to you about risk management option closures.
Good morning, everybody. Like Natasha said, I'm with District Support Program out of Tallahassee, which was formerly the District and Business Support Program that Brian Doherty ran. I'm going to do a brief overview of the risk management options. Closures are very site specific, so this is going to be just a sort of general broad overview. So I want to start off by emphasizing that one risk management option or RMO is not better than another one. I think that there's a misconception that RMO 1 is the best closure option, but if the criteria is met for RMO 1, 2, or 3, then the main objective is to mitigate any sort of risk. And if controls need to be implemented to mitigate that risk, then the ultimate goal is to make sure that human health and the environment are protected. So one RMO is not better than another one. 2 isn't better than 3. 1 isn't better than 2 and 3. I also want to mention that the RMO process is progressive. So you first compare your data that you've collected, your assessment data or your remedial data, and determine if you've met RMO 1. And if you haven't met the RMO 1 criteria, then you look at RMO 2. And if you haven't met the RMO 2 criteria, then you go into RMO 3. So briefly, and I'm going to get into these in a little bit more detail in subsequent slides, RMO 1 does not have any controls. RMO 2 usually closes with, it has institutional and/or engineering controls in place, and the contamination is limited to the source property. And then RMO 3 closes with engineering and/or institutional controls, and the contamination can extend beyond the property boundary. It also can be closed without controls if there's an alternative cleanup target level that's non-site specific. So for RMO 1, groundwater should not have any contaminants of concern above the groundwater cleanup target levels in Chapter 6278 or 777 Florida Administrative Code. Surface water and sediment impacts aren't present, and neither is free product. And the soil needs to meet contaminants of concern in soil need to meet the soil cleanup target levels in Chapter 62777 FAC. And the leachate concentrations should not be above the applicable groundwater cleanup target levels. For all of the risk management options for soil, there are different ways you can evaluate your soil data. You can either do discrete samples and compare those directly to the CTLs, or you can calculate a 95% UCL, upper confidence level, depending on what your exposure unit is, or you can also collect incremental sampling methodology samples. Composite samples are not acceptable for decision-making purposes, so composite samples are not considered appropriate for evaluating your closure criteria. Similarly, for leachability, you can also evaluate leachability using different methods. You can do direct testing, which is synthetic precipitation leaching procedure, or SPLP, or if you have a permeable surface that's been open for filtration for over 2 years, you can do groundwater sampling to demonstrate that you don't have a leachability problem, or you can do site-specific. You can calculate an alternative leachability CTL. So for risk management options 2 and 3, there are a lot of criteria that are similar for both of the closure options. Institutional and, if necessary, engineering controls can be implemented to mitigate the risk. Free product can be present in RMO 2 and 3 closures, but it needs to be demonstrated that the free product is either not technically feasible or cost effective to remove, and the free product doesn't pose a risk. Unlike risk management option 1, the exposure units for RMO 2 and 3 can be greater than a quarter acre, but it needs to be demonstrated that adequate samples were collected in order to make that evaluation. And this can also result in an institutional control that means that you can't subdivide the property for the exposure unit that you've evaluated. And alternative soil cleanup target levels can be established. Some of the main differences between RMO 2 and 3 include risk management 2 options. The impacts are limited to within the source property, so they don't go beyond the source property boundaries. And the impacts are less than a quarter acre in size. And then, as shown on this slide here, for risk management 3, no controls are necessary if an alternative cleanup target level is based on non-site specific exposure factors. So for example, if intrinsic toxicity values have been updated since the promulgation of the Chapter 62777 FAC, CTLs have been published, you may propose an alternative CTL that's still protective. It's just based on new science, and so you don't have to have a control for that, but it would still get registered with the Institutional Control Registry. Noticing is required, even for non-recorded institutional controls, which were discussed previously. And again, any sort of alternative CTL or conditional closure needs to be listed in the Institutional Control Registry. So that was a very fast, brief overview of the risk management options. I didn't want to get into too many details because, especially with conditional closures, they are very site-specific. Like I said, it's a progressive process. You may meet some requirements in RMO 2, but then maybe you need to get kicked into RMO 3. So it's a very site-specific process to evaluate the criteria for closure. My contact information is available here. Don't forget the J. It's leah.j.smith@floridadep.gov. And my phone number is 850-245-8717. Our group, the district support program, is a highly technical group, so feel free to reach out if you have technical questions or questions regarding how to get to closure. It's better to evaluate your path to closure earlier. Your conceptual site model will change as you get additional data, but if you have an end goal, it really helps to evaluate your closure options earlier than later. Like James said, you don't want to get to the end and then abandon your wells and end up having to do more work. Thank you.